My boyfriend thought dressing as my dead father for Halloween was funny. I showed him what funny really looks like. My boyfriend said he wanted to do something funny for Halloween, and I thought he meant like a stupid vampire costume or one of those inflatable T-Rex suits that look ridiculous when you walk through the door. I never, not in a million years, thought he would actually show up at my apartment building dressed as my dead father. I opened the door and froze. There he was, wearing my father's old brown cardigan that smelled faintly of mothballs and cigarettes. The same plaid shirt my dad had always tucked in. The same round glasses perched on his nose. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like I was swallowing bricks. I couldn't move. My voice completely gone. My hands frozen on the door handle. "Ha! Surprise!" he said, grinning like it was a joke we were both in on, like this was supposed to be funny. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the pumpkin I was carrying. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to run away and never look back. My roommates peeked out from the living room, trying to figure out what kind of cruel trick was happening. "It's just a costume," he said again, coming closer, holding a candy bucket. I stepped back, heart hammering. "Do you even hear yourself? Do you even know what you're doing?" I shouted. He tilted his head, eyes wide, like he didn't understand. Like the world was a playground and he got to decide which pieces were allowed to hurt people and which weren't. I grabbed the pumpkin like it was a shield and waved it in front of him. "This isn't funny." He laughed. I could feel the blood rush in my ears. My roommate June whispered, "Is he dressed as your dad?" I nodded. My lips are quivering. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave. Part of me wanted to slap him. Part of me wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. He stepped closer, leaning like he was going to pat my shoulder in that familiar, fake, comforting way my dad used to, the one that never comforted anyone. I flinched back and my foot hit the side of the coffee table. A glass wobbled. I could hear it rattling. He didn't care. He didn't even notice. "Come on, babe," he said. "It's just Halloween. You know I love a good prank." My stomach twisted. I could feel my hands shaking. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shove him out the door. "A prank? You dressed as my dead father as a prank? Are you insane? Do you even think about what you're doing to me?" I yelled. He froze for a second, blinking, like he had never imagined that costumes could have consequences. Then he shrugged and said, "I thought it would be funny. You're too serious." Too serious? I wanted to hit him. I wanted to shake him. I wanted him to understand, really understand, that this wasn't funny, that this wasn't a joke. My roommate finally stepped forward, voice low and sharp. "This is not okay. This is beyond weird. This is cruel." He laughed again. I felt like my stomach was going to collapse completely. "You need to calm down," he said, smiling like he had done nothing wrong. I grabbed the candy bucket and threw it at him, hard. It hit his chest and fell to the floor, candies scattering everywhere. He didn't move. He just looked at me like I was being dramatic. My hands were shaking. I could feel my vision narrowing. Every memory of my dad, every time I'd heard him laugh, every time I'd seen him sit in his chair in the living room, every time he'd taught me how to ride a bike, every time he'd told me it would build character, it all collided into this single, blinding, unbearable point of rage. I stepped forward, chest heaving. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you realize how disgusting this is? You have no boundaries. This is my father. My dead father. And you—" I stopped. I couldn't finish. There were tears in my eyes. My roommate was staring at both of us. I wanted him gone. I wanted him to leave the apartment. I wanted him to understand, in some way that words couldn't convey, that what he had done was unforgivable. He finally raised his hands. Okay, don't get upset." His voice was fake calm, patronizing, like he always did when he thought he was right and I was overreacting. And that's when it snapped. Something inside me, some long-held patience that had been stretched thin by the way he always acted like nothing mattered, that everything was just a joke, that nothing serious existed unless it directly benefited him. Something inside me broke completely. I pointed at the door, my finger shaking so hard it looked like I was pointing at 10 different things. "Get out of my apartment right now." My voice came out louder than I meant it to, shaking with something I didn't even recognize in myself, something that felt like it had been building for months and just exploded all at once. He stood there in my father's clothes, his face doing this confused thing like he couldn't understand why I was being so mean to him, like he was the victim here, and that look made me want to scream even louder. June moved fast, stepping right between us, her body blocking him from getting any closer to me. "You need to leave immediately." Her voice was firm, protective, the way she talks to creeps who won't leave her alone at bars. He blinked a few times, then finally started pulling off the cardigan, moving so slowly like he was doing us this huge favor, like we should be grateful he was listening at all. I watched his hands fold the sleeves and I wanted to scream at how casual he was being about this whole thing, how he could just take off my dad's clothes like it was nothing, like they were just some random costume he'd rented. I couldn't stand watching him touch it anymore. I lunged forward and grabbed the cardigan right out of his hands before he could fold it properly, clutching it against my chest so hard my knuckles went white. "He doesn't get to touch my father's things anymore." Not after this. Not ever again. The smell hit me immediately. This awful mix of my dad's old cologne that I'd sprayed on the cardigan months ago when I missed him too much, mixed with his cheap body spray that he uses way too much of. My stomach turned and I had to breathe through my mouth because the combination was making me feel sick, making me realize I'd have to wash this cardigan like 5 times to get his smell out of the fabric, to get him out of something that belonged to my dad. Can we just talk about this like adults? He used that calm voice, that talking down to me voice he always uses when he thinks I'm being crazy or too emotional. I told him there was nothing to talk about and he needed to leave right now, but instead of listening, he just walked over to my couch and sat down, settling in like he was planning to stay for hours, like he was getting ready for some long talk where he'd explain to me why I was wrong to be upset. Aria's door opened and she came out, her hair still wet from the shower, looking between all of us trying to figure out what was happening. "Did you seriously dress as her dead father for Halloween?" she asked him directly. No build-up, just straight to the point like she always does. His face went red and he started talking fast, explaining that it was supposed to be funny, that I always say I want to remember my dad, so he thought this would be a nice surprise, that he spent all week getting the costume perfect. Aria just stared at him with her mouth a little bit open, not saying anything, and the silence was somehow worse than if she'd yelled at him. I could see her looking at the plaid shirt, the glasses, putting together how much effort he'd put into mocking my dead father. I realized he wasn't going to leave on his own, that he was just going to sit there on my couch trying to convince me I was being dramatic until I gave up and apologized to him. "If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the building manager to have you removed." He finally stood up, throwing his hands in the air like I was being so unfair, so unreasonable, and headed toward the door while saying something under his breath about how I can't take a joke, how everything always has to be so serious with me. He stopped right at the door and turned around. "We'll talk when you've calmed down." Like this was just me being emotional. Like tomorrow I'd wake up and realize I'd overreacted and apologize for embarrassing him. "Don't contact me at all," I said, and he laughed. Actually laughed, like he didn't believe I meant it. Like he thought I'd be texting him in an hour, asking him to come back. That laugh made something click in my head, made me realize he'd never actually listened to anything I said, that every time I told him something bothered me, he'd just wait for me to get over it instead of actually hearing me. After he left, I collapsed onto the couch, just completely fell into it like my legs couldn't hold me up anymore. I started crying, these big ugly sobs that made my whole body shake, and June and Aria sat down on either side of me without saying anything at first. They didn't try to make excuses for him or suggest maybe I was being too harsh. Didn't do that thing people sometimes do where they try to see both sides. They just let me cry. And after a few minutes, June said what he did was completely messed up, and Aria agreed. And hearing them say it made me cry harder because I'd been so scared they'd think I was overreacting. June got up and came back with tea, the kind with honey that she knows I like, and Aria grabbed my phone off the coffee table. "Let me block his number before he starts texting you." I was shaking so hard that when I tried to take a sip of the tea, some of it spilled onto my shirt. And I realized this wasn't just about tonight. This was about every single time he'd dismissed my feelings and called it a joke. Every time he'd made me feel crazy for being upset about something he did. My phone started buzzing in Aria's hand before she could finish blocking him, like he'd been typing the whole walk back to his car. She looked at the screen and her face did this thing where I could tell whatever he was saying was bad. He's saying you embarrassed him in front of your roommates and he deserves an apology. The nerve of it, the complete nerve of sending that after what he just did. It made me laugh in this weird broken way that didn't sound anything like my normal laugh, this bitter sound that came out of my throat before I could stop it. Aria held the phone away from me and kept reading, and I could see her getting madder with each text that came through. Aria finished blocking the number and looked up at me with this serious expression I'd only seen a few times before. She said we should block him on social media too before he started posting his side of the story and making me look crazy. I nodded and handed her my phone because my hands were still shaking too much to do it myself. We spent the next hour going through every platform, Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and even LinkedIn, because he was petty enough to try anything. That's when Aria found the photos. She stopped scrolling and her face went pale and she turned the screen toward me without saying anything. There he was in my dad's costume, taking selfies in what looked like his bathroom mirror, grinning like he'd just won some prize. There were 5 photos total, different angles and poses, and in one of them he was doing a thumbs up. He'd been so proud of his idea that he documented it before even coming to my apartment. I felt sick looking at how happy he looked, how pleased with himself, like he genuinely thought this was comedy gold, and I was going to love it. June leaned over to see what we were looking at and said something I can't repeat here, but it perfectly captured how disgusting the whole thing was. I made Aria delete the photos from his account before blocking him completely, and watching them disappear felt like taking back some tiny piece of control. After we finished with social media, I opened our text messages because I wanted to see if there were signs I'd missed, red flags I'd ignored. I scrolled back through weeks of conversations and found exactly what I was afraid of finding. There was a message from 3 weeks ago where I told him I was having a really hard day because something reminded me of my dad, and he responded with a joke about zombie movies. 2 weeks before that, I'd sent him a long message about missing my dad's birthday and feeling guilty for not visiting the grave more often, and he'd changed the subject to ask what I wanted for dinner. I kept scrolling and finding more of the same thing, me sharing something real and painful, and him either making a joke or acting like I hadn't said anything important at all. June was reading over my shoulder and she pointed at one exchange where I'd apologized for being emotional about my dad, and she said I shouldn't have had to apologize for grieving. She started pointing out other messages, showing me this pattern I'd been too close to see, where every time I expressed a real feeling he either dismissed it or made me feel bad for having it. I realized I'd been making excuses for him for months, telling myself he just wasn't good with emotions, or that I was being too sensitive because I was still grieving. But looking at all these messages together, seeing the pattern laid out in blue and gray text bubbles, I couldn't pretend anymore that this was normal or okay. Around midnight, we were still sitting on the couch, June and Arya on either side of me like bodyguards, when someone knocked on the door. All three of us froze and looked at each other, and my stomach dropped because I knew exactly who it was. June got up slowly and walked to the door and checked the peephole, and when she turned around, her face confirmed what I already knew. She mouthed his name, and I shook my head hard, telling her not to open it, and she nodded and came back to sit with me. He knocked again, harder this time, and then his voice came through the door saying he just wanted to talk, that he was sorry I got upset. The non-apology made my blood boil all over again because he wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry that I reacted badly to his hilarious joke. He kept saying he wanted to explain, that if I would just listen, I'd understand he didn't mean anything by it, and every word made me angrier because he still didn't get it. Arya squeezed my hand and whispered that we didn't have to respond, that we could just wait him out, and I nodded because I didn't trust myself to yell through the door without completely losing it. He kept knocking and talking through the door for what felt like forever, but was probably 10 minutes. He tried different approaches, starting with the fake apologetic tone, then switching to frustrated and saying I was being unreasonable, then back to sweet and saying he missed me and wanted to fix this. We sat there in complete silence, not moving, barely breathing. Like if we were quiet enough, he would think we weren't home even though he obviously knew we were. Arya finally stood up and walked close to the door and said loudly that if he didn't leave right now, she was calling the police for harassment. There was silence on the other side for a few seconds, and then I heard his footsteps retreating down the hallway, heavy and angry sounding. June went to check the peephole again and confirmed he was gone, and only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. I felt sick and shaky and violated in my own home, like he'd proven he didn't respect my boundaries even when I stated them clearly, even when I had witnesses, even when I literally would not open the door. The apartment didn't feel safe anymore, and I hated him for taking that away from me too. I couldn't sleep that night even though I was exhausted down to my bones. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling and listening to every small sound in the hallway, jumping every time someone walked past my door. Around 3 a.m, I gave up and grabbed my phone and started looking through photos of my dad. I had hundreds of them. Pictures from before he got sick when he still looked like himself, and I scrolled through them crying quietly so I wouldn't wake up June and Arya. I found myself whispering apologies to the pictures, saying I was sorry for letting someone mock his memory like that, sorry for not throwing my boyfriend out the second I saw what he was wearing. The rational part of my brain knew my dad wouldn't blame me, but the grief part felt like I'd failed to protect something sacred. I kept thinking about how my dad would have reacted if he'd been alive to see this, and I knew he would have been furious. Not at me, but at someone who thought trauma was entertainment. My dad had always been protective, sometimes too protective, but right now I missed that feeling of having someone who would fight for me without me having to ask. I cried harder because I knew my dad would have hated seeing me with someone who treated me this way, and I felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. The next morning, I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop on my nightstand. I grabbed it with my eyes still half closed and saw 17 missed calls from him, all within the last hour, plus a voicemail notification. I played the voicemail on speaker and immediately regretted it when his voice filled my room saying he was coming over this afternoon to get his stuff that he kept at my place. He said it in this matter-of-fact tone like of course I would let him in, like last night hadn't happened, like he had some automatic right to access my apartment whenever he wanted. June must have heard it from her room because she knocked on my door and came in still wearing her pajamas. She sat on the edge of my bed and said there was no way I was dealing with him alone, that she and Arya would both be here when he came, and I felt this wave of gratitude that made my eyes water again. She said he wasn't going to corner me or manipulate me or make me feel guilty, not with witnesses there to see exactly what he was doing. I nodded and tried to thank her, but my voice came out scratchy and broken from crying all night. I spent the morning gathering his belongings from around my apartment, and it was shocking how much of my space he'd gradually taken over. There was a whole drawer of his clothes in my dresser, his toothbrush in my bathroom, his deodorant, and cologne on my counter, his books on my shelf mixed in with mine, his jacket on my coat hook, his phone charger by my bed, his favorite coffee mug in my cabinet. I put everything in a big black garbage bag, and it felt petty, but also necessary. Like I was physically removing him from my life one object at a time. Each item I grabbed made me realize how much he'd spread into every corner of my apartment, how he'd made himself at home without ever actually respecting my home. The garbage bag got heavier and heavier, and by the time I was done it was almost full. This physical representation of 2 years of him gradually occupying more and more of my space. I tied the bag closed and put it by the door and stared at it for a minute, thinking about how easy it was to remove someone's stuff, but how much harder it would be to remove them from my head. He showed up at exactly 2 in the afternoon like he'd announced in his voicemail, and I heard him in the hallway before he even knocked because he was talking to someone. June checked the peephole and said he brought Omar with him, and I felt this flash of anger that he'd brought backup, like this was some kind of confrontation that needed witnesses. I grabbed the garbage bag and opened the door just wide enough to shove it through, and there he was with Omar standing slightly behind him, looking uncomfortable. Omar wouldn't make eye contact with me and kept staring at the floor, and I wondered what version of last night's events he'd been told. I held out the garbage bag and said this was everything, and he needed to leave now, and he tried to push the door open wider like he was planning to come inside and check. I pushed back against the door and said no, he wasn't coming in. This was everything, and he needed to take it and go. June appeared beside me and physically blocked the door with her body, standing in the opening like a wall. She told him in this cold voice I'd never heard her use before that he wasn't welcome here anymore, that he needed to take his stuff and leave and not come back. He started to argue, saying he just wanted to make sure I hadn't missed anything, and June cut him off and said she didn't care what he wanted. Omar finally spoke up and said they should just go. His voice quiet but firm, and he put his hand on his friend's shoulder like he was trying to pull him away. I saw something in Omar's face when he looked at his friend. This expression that was part disappointment and part recognition, and I got the feeling this wasn't the first time he'd watched his friend cross lines and hurt people. Omar grabbed the garbage bag and started walking toward the stairs, and for a second I thought it was over. But before leaving, he turned around and looked at me with this expression that was trying to be sad, but came across as angry. He said I was going to regret throwing away our relationship over one mistake, that I was overreacting and I'd realize it eventually. Something snapped in me and I stepped forward, June still blocking him from coming closer, and I said it wasn't one mistake. I told him it was 2 years of him dismissing my feelings and treating my trauma like entertainment, 2 years of making me feel crazy for having normal emotional responses to things, 2 years of him crossing boundaries and then acting like I was the problem for having boundaries in the first place. I saw Omar's eyes widen like he was connecting dots he'd been ignoring, like pieces were falling into place that he'd been trying not to see. His friend started to respond, but Omar pulled him harder toward the stairs and said they were leaving now, and this time his voice had more force behind it. I watched them disappear down the stairwell and stood there frozen for a minute, before June gently pulled me back inside and locked the door. The click of the deadbolt felt important somehow, like I was locking him out of more than just the apartment. I sat on the couch and put my head in my hands, and Aria came over and sat next to me. I asked her if she thought I was overreacting, if maybe I should have let him explain himself better. She looked at me for a second and then got up and grabbed her laptop from her room. She came back and opened it on the coffee table and started typing. She pulled up articles about emotional manipulation and gaslighting and turned the screen toward me. I started reading and felt this weird sensation in my chest, like something was unlocking that had been stuck for years. Every single tactic was described in these clinical terms, and I recognized all of them from my relationship. The minimizing, the making me doubt my own reactions, the way he'd turn his cruelty into jokes I was supposed to laugh at. Arya pointed to one section about how manipulators make their targets feel crazy for having normal emotional responses, and I remembered every time he'd told me I was too sensitive or too serious. June brought over tea and sat on my other side, and we spent the whole afternoon going through article after article. I kept saying things like, I can't believe I didn't see this before, and they both kept telling me that's exactly what manipulation does. It makes you blind to what's happening. June ordered Chinese food around 6, and we had this impromptu therapy session right there in the living room, where they helped me connect dots I'd been refusing to see. I told them about the time he'd made fun of my weight in front of his friends, and then said I couldn't take a joke when I got upset. I told them about when he'd shared a private story about my dad's death at a party for laughs, and then acted like I was being dramatic for crying in the bathroom. They both just listened and validated every single feeling, and I realized I'd been waiting for someone to tell me I wasn't crazy for 2 whole years. My phone buzzed on the coffee table and I saw a text from Himina asking if I was okay because she heard what happened. I stared at the message confused because I hadn't told anyone outside the apartment yet. I texted back asking how she knew, and she explained that Omar had told their whole friend group about the Halloween costume, and now people were asking questions about other pranks he'd pulled. I felt this mix of embarrassment that people knew, and relief that I wasn't going to have to explain it myself. Himena asked if she could come over, and I said yes because I needed to know what people were saying. She showed up an hour later with wine and hugged me at the door before coming inside. We sat in the living room, and she immediately launched into this story about how he'd pulled a prank on his ex-girlfriend where he pretended to lose her cat for 3 days. She described how the ex had been completely panicked, putting up flyers and calling shelters, and the whole time he'd had the cat at his friend's apartment. My stomach twisted because I remembered him telling me that story months ago, and he'd made it sound hilarious, like the ex was being overdramatic about a cat. I'd laughed because I didn't know her side of it. Didn't know she'd been genuinely terrified her pet was dead. Jimena could see my face changing, and she said that's exactly why she wanted to tell me. Because he has this way of reframing his cruelty to make it sound funny when you don't know the full context. She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots from their friend group chat, where people were sharing stories about his pranks. I scrolled through message after message and saw this clear pattern of him targeting people's vulnerabilities and calling it humor. Someone mentioned he'd made a joke about their friend's miscarriage at a party, and I felt my hands start shaking because I remembered that night. I'd left early because something felt wrong, but I couldn't articulate what it was, and now I knew it was because I'd watched him mock someone's grief, and everyone had laughed because they didn't know how else to react. Himena pointed to another message about how he'd once pretended to forget his girlfriend's birthday for a week as a prank, and I realized every single story followed the same structure. He'd find what hurt someone most, and he'd poke at it until they broke, and then he'd act like they were being too sensitive when they got upset. I asked Himena why no one had said anything before, and she admitted they'd all been uncomfortable. But nobody wanted to be the one to call him out, because he'd just turn it around and make them look like the problem. I grabbed my notebook from the coffee table and started writing down every incident I could remember where he'd crossed a line, and then made me feel crazy for being upset. The first page filled up fast with things like the time he'd told his mom I was bad with money, when I'd just been careful about spending, or when he'd posted an unflattering photo of me online after I'd asked him not to and said I was being vain. The second page covered all the times he'd dismissed my grief about Dad, making jokes about death or changing the subject when I needed to talk. The third page was smaller things that had built up over time, like how he'd criticize my cooking, and then say he was just trying to help me improve, or how he'd make plans without asking me and then get mad when I couldn't drop everything to join him. I stared at these 3 pages and felt stupid for staying so long, but also validated that my anger was completely justified. June read over my shoulder and pointed out that each incident ended with him making me apologize for being upset, and I realized that was the pattern. He'd hurt me, and somehow I'd end up being the one saying sorry. Himena suggested I talk to his ex-girlfriend directly because she'd apparently gone through something really similar and might help me understand I wasn't alone. I hesitated because I didn't want to seem like I was building some kind of case against him, like I was trying to gather evidence to prove he was terrible. Himena said it wasn't about building a case, it was about understanding the pattern, so I could heal without second-guessing myself for the next 6 months. She offered to connect us, and I said okay, because part of me needed to know this wasn't just me, that I hadn't somehow brought this on myself by being too sensitive like he always said. Himena sent a message right there while sitting on my couch, and within 10 minutes her phone buzzed with a response. The ex-girlfriend's name was Lotta, and she messaged me first after Himena connected us. Her message was kind and straightforward, saying she was sorry I went through this and that she recognized the Halloween costume incident as exactly the kind of thing he does. She wrote that he has this talent for finding someone's deepest pain and poking at it and then acting confused when they react badly. She said she'd be happy to talk if I wanted to, and I immediately said yes because I needed to hear from someone who'd survived him and come out okay on the other side. We switched to a phone call and ended up talking for 2 hours straight. She described the exact same cycle I'd experienced, where he'd do something hurtful and she'd get upset, and he'd call her too sensitive and she'd end up apologizing for overreacting. She told me about the cat prank in detail, and I could hear the pain still in her voice even though it had been over a year. She said it took her 6 months after their breakup to stop second-guessing her own feelings about everything, to trust that her emotional reactions were normal and valid and not some character flaw like he'd convinced her they were. Lotta mentioned that he has a brother who's actually really kind and had apologized to her after the breakup for not seeing what was happening during their relationship. I realized she was talking about Marlon, and I'd met him a few times at family dinners. He'd always seemed uncomfortable around his brother's jokes, like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. I wondered if he'd seen things I'd been too close to notice, if he'd watched his brother hurt me the same way he'd watched him hurt Lotta and felt powerless to stop it. Lotta said Marlon had reached out to her months after they broke up to say he was sorry for not speaking up, that he'd been trained since childhood to excuse his brother's behavior, and he was working on breaking that pattern. The conversation with Lotta made me feel less alone, but also sad that there was apparently a trail of women who'd been through this same cycle with him, all of us thinking we were the problem until we got far enough away to see clearly. My phone rang 2 hours after I hung up with Lotta, and I saw Salvador's name on the screen. Mom had told him everything, and he sounded mad in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids, and someone broke my bike on purpose. He said he was getting in the car right now and he'd be there in 3 hours, and I should make a list of anything I needed from the store. I told him he didn't have to drive all that way, but he was already starting his engine and I could hear him putting the call on speaker. He showed up at my door with 4 grocery bags and a pizza from my favorite place near his apartment, the one that makes the garlic knots I used to eat every weekend when I visited him in college. I opened the door and saw his face and just started crying again, the kind of crying where you can't really breathe right and your whole chest hurts. He put the bags down and hugged me and didn't say anything about me getting tears and snot all over his jacket. June and Arya gave us space and went to Arya's room, and I realized how alone I'd felt the past 2 years, how much I'd stopped calling my family because he always made comments about me being too attached to them. We unpacked the groceries and Salvador had brought all my comfort foods, the specific brand of mac and cheese I liked as a kid, the cookies Dad used to hide in the pantry, even the weird potato chips I couldn't find anywhere near my apartment. He started making dinner and asked me to tell him everything, and I went through the whole story again, starting with Halloween night. Salvador listened without interrupting, and I watched his jaw get tighter and tighter as I described the costume and the dismissive way my ex had acted. When I finished, he put down the spoon he was holding and turned to look at me. He told me he'd never liked my boyfriend but hadn't said anything because I seemed happy whenever I talked about the relationship. I asked him what he saw that I didn't, and Salvador described how my ex would make small comments about me in front of other people, little jokes about how I was too sensitive or too serious or too worried about things that didn't matter. He said the comments always came with a laugh, so if anyone looked uncomfortable, he could act like he was just joking around, and I was the one taking it too seriously. Salvador mentioned family dinners where my ex would tell stories that made me look silly or overdramatic, and then pat my hand like he was being affectionate. I felt sick remembering those dinners and how I'd laughed along because I didn't want to seem like I couldn't take a joke. Salvador said he'd pulled Mom aside once to ask if she noticed it, and she had, but they both decided to stay quiet because I was an adult, and they didn't want to interfere. I understood why they hadn't said anything, but part of me wished someone had pointed it out sooner, had given me permission to trust my own discomfort. We spent the evening on the couch watching old action movies that Dad used to put on every weekend, the ones with terrible dialogue and explosions that made no sense. Salvador grabbed the remote during a commercial break and said something about how Dad would have punched anyone who disrespected me the way my ex had. The comment came out casual, like he was just stating a fact, but it hit me hard enough that I started laughing and crying at the same time. Salvador looked worried until I explained I was okay, that I just realized I'd spent so long trying not to be too sensitive that I'd forgotten I actually deserved basic respect from someone who claimed to love me. He nodded and said Dad had always told him to watch out for me not because I was weak, but because some people see kindness as a target. We finished the movie and I fell asleep on the couch with my head on Salvador's shoulder, feeling safer than I had in months. The next morning my phone buzzed with a message from Omar asking if we could talk, and my first instinct was to block him immediately. I read the message 3 times looking for some trap or trick until I got to the part where he said he wanted to apologize for his part in what happened. I showed the message to Arya and she offered to come with me if I decided to meet him, said she'd sit at a nearby table and run interference if he tried anything manipulative. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near campus, and I spent the whole walk there trying to figure out what he could possibly say that would make any difference. Omar was already sitting at a table when we arrived, and he looked genuinely uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before, like he'd been up all night thinking about this conversation. Arya took a table close enough to hear if I needed her, and Omar immediately started talking about how he'd known the costume was a terrible idea from the moment his friend mentioned it. He said he'd tried to talk him out of it, but didn't push hard enough because he'd spent years dismissing his own instincts when it came to his friend's pranks. Omar described how he'd watched his friend do things that made people uncomfortable for years, always laughing it off, always convincing everyone, including Omar, that it was just harmless fun. He said he'd been thinking about all the times he'd seen someone's face fall after one of the pranks, and how he'd just joined in the laughter instead of checking if they were actually okay. I listened and tried to figure out if this was genuine or just another manipulation tactic, but Omar kept going, talking about how he'd realized he'd been complicit in hurting people by staying silent. He pulled out his phone and showed me texts from weeks before Halloween where he'd tried to talk his friend out of the costume idea, messages saying it was too far and would really hurt me. I read through them and saw Omar had tried at least a little bit, but I told him trying wasn't the same as actually stopping someone, that sending a few texts and then showing up anyway made him part of the problem. Omar nodded and said he understood that now, that he was planning to distance himself from the friendship because he couldn't keep making excuses for behavior he knew was wrong. Arya came over to our table and asked Omar directly if he thought his friend understood why what he did was wrong. Omar hesitated, and I could see him choosing his words carefully before he said he thought his friend genuinely didn't see other people's pain as real, if it was inconvenient for him. The way he said it, so clinical and detached, made me realize I'd dated someone who actually lacked basic empathy, and somehow convinced me that was normal. We finished our coffees, and Omar apologized again before leaving, and Arya asked me if I felt any better after the conversation. I said I didn't know, but at least Omar had tried to take responsibility for his part, which was more than I expected from anyone in that friend group. I went back to work after taking 2 days off, and my coworkers were supportive without asking too many questions about what happened. They'd noticed I seemed off, and a few people brought me coffee or offered to help with my projects without making a big deal about it. My boss called me into her office around lunch, and I thought I was in trouble for taking the time off, but she just said she'd noticed I seemed distracted, and I should take whatever time I needed. I started tearing up right there in her office because I wasn't used to people actually prioritizing my well-being over productivity or convenience. She handed me tissues and told me about a bad breakup she'd gone through years ago, and how taking time to process it had been the best decision she'd made. I thanked her and went back to my desk feeling a little less alone in all of this. The next day, I walked outside for my lunch break and froze when I saw my ex standing across the street, just watching the building entrance like he was waiting for me. My coworker Sarah came out behind me and noticed me staring and asked if I was okay. I pointed him out and she immediately asked if I wanted her to call security, and I said yes without even thinking about it. Sarah went back inside and 2 security guards came out within minutes, and I watched from the doorway as they walked over to my ex and talked to him. He gestured toward me and tried to explain something, but they escorted him away from the building and told him not to come back. Watching him get removed from my workplace gave me this surge of power I hadn't felt in years, like I was finally taking up space and setting boundaries that people actually respected. I went back inside and Sarah asked if I was okay, and I realized I actually was. That seeing him get consequences for his behavior made everything feel more real and less like something I'd imagined. That night, I opened my email and saw a long message from him with the subject line saying we needed to talk. I read through it 3 times looking for an actual apology, and found nothing except paragraphs about how I'd turned our friends against him and ruined his reputation over a misunderstanding. He wrote about how hurt he was that I'd ended things without giving him a chance to explain, how I'd made him look bad by telling people what happened, how he'd always supported me and this was how I repaid him. Every paragraph focused on his pain and his reputation, and how I'd wronged him by having boundaries and telling the truth. I read it again, and realized there wasn't a single sentence where he acknowledged what he'd actually done or how it had affected me, just pages of him playing the victim and making my trauma about his inconvenience. I opened a new email and forwarded the whole thing to Lada without adding any commentary, because the email spoke for itself. She responded within 5 minutes saying she got almost the exact same message when she broke up with him, down to the specific phrases about ruining his reputation and not giving him a chance to explain. We started texting back and forth about how he apparently kept a template for playing the victim, just swapping out names and specific incidents while keeping the core manipulation intact. The absurdity of it made me laugh in this sharp, bitter way that felt good, like I was finally seeing the joke instead of being the punchline. Lada sent screenshots of her email and I compared them side by side, finding whole sentences that were identical, and something shifted in my chest where the guilt had been sitting. 2 days later, a message popped up on social media from someone named Marlon asking if I was willing to talk, and I stared at the name for a solid minute before remembering he was my ex's brother. I almost deleted it, but something made me click through to his profile, and I saw photos of him with Arya at family gatherings, which explained how he found me. I messaged back saying I'd meet him for coffee, but only in a public place, and he agreed immediately, and suggested a cafe near my work. We met on a Saturday afternoon, and he looked uncomfortable the moment he sat down, apologizing 3 times before the barista even brought our drinks. He told me he'd heard what happened from multiple people, and he was sorry for his brother's behavior, that he'd been trying to get him to see a therapist for years, because these patterns weren't normal or okay. I asked what he meant by patterns, and Marlon hesitated, clearly trying to figure out how much to say, before explaining that his brother had been doing stuff like this since they were kids, but their parents always excused it as him being funny or charming. He mentioned a time in high school when his brother convinced a girl her dead grandmother's necklace had fallen down a drain as a prank, and their mom had laughed about it at dinner that night. I felt sick hearing that, realizing the Halloween costume wasn't some weird one-time thing, but part of a long history of finding people's pain and poking at it for entertainment. Marlon leaned forward and said he was a therapist himself, then carefully added that he couldn't diagnose his brother, but the behavior pattern suggested someone who didn't process other people as fully real, more like characters in a story he got to write. He told me it wasn't my job to fix him, and that leaving was the healthiest choice I could make, which hit different coming from a professional, instead of just my friends trying to make me feel better. I asked him if he thought his brother would ever change, and Marlon was quiet for a long time before answering honestly that change requires someone wanting to change, and his brother had never faced real consequences before. Every time something happened, their parents smoothed it over, or the friend group moved on, or the girlfriend eventually forgave him, so he never had to actually look at his behavior and decide it was wrong. Marlon mentioned that he'd tried talking to his brother about therapy multiple times over the years, but it always turned into a joke or an accusation that Marlon was being too serious. The same thing my ex always said to me. We finished our coffees and Marlon apologized again before leaving, and I sat there for another 20 minutes just processing the conversation. Something about hearing it laid out so clearly made me stop waiting for my ex to suddenly understand what he did wrong, this hope I'd been holding on to that he'd have some big revelation and apologize properly. I realized that wasn't going to happen, and I didn't need it to move forward, that I could just decide I was done, and that would be enough. Marlon had given me his card before leaving, and told me to call if I ever needed to talk, and at the bottom was the name of a therapist he recommended if I wanted to process everything that happened. I made an appointment that same day, and went to my first session the following week, sitting in this small office with plants everywhere while the therapist asked me why I stayed in a relationship, where my feelings were constantly dismissed. I started talking about not wanting to be too much or too sensitive, and she stopped me, asking where I learned that being sensitive was bad. And I realized I'd been carrying that fear since childhood when my mom used to tell me I took things too personally. My ex had figured out that fear existed and used it perfectly, making every valid complaint I had into evidence that I was overreacting or being dramatic. The therapist wrote something down and told me my anger about the Halloween incident was actually healthy, that I'd been suppressing appropriate emotional responses for years because I was taught they were wrong. She said I had permission to be furious, and something unlocked in my chest that had been tight since my dad died, this pressure I didn't even know I was holding. I went home that night and pulled out a notebook, starting a letter to my dad telling him about everything that happened. I wrote about the Halloween costume and the breakup, and how I was sorry for letting someone disrespect his memory like that, and the words just poured out until I'd filled 6 pages front and back. Writing it made me cry, but it also helped me separate my grief about losing Dad from my anger about the relationship. 2 things that had gotten tangled together until I couldn't tell which feeling belonged to which situation. I put the letter in an envelope and tucked it into the box where I kept Dad's watch and his reading glasses. Not mailing it, obviously, but putting it somewhere safe felt important. June knocked on my door around 9 that night and told me she and Arya wanted to throw a small dinner at our apartment. Nothing big, just the people who actually cared about me. We planned it for the following weekend and invited Jimena, Lada, and Salvador, and when the day came, our living room filled with the smell of the pasta Arya was making and the sound of everyone talking over each other. We didn't mention my ex at all, just shared stories and laughed about random stuff, and I looked around the table realizing I had a support system that actually saw me as a full person, instead of a supporting character in someone else's story. 3 weeks later, I went to a mutual friend's birthday party, and froze when I saw my ex standing by the drink table, watching me with this sad puppy dog expression, like I was supposed to feel bad for him. He started walking toward me and I felt my stomach drop, but then I just turned away and continued my conversation with Jimena about her new job, keeping my back to him the entire time. He hovered nearby for a few minutes before finally leaving, and the ability to simply ignore him, to treat him like he didn't matter anymore, felt like the biggest victory I'd had in months. A month passed and I got a friend request on social media from someone I didn't recognize at first. Then I saw her profile picture with my ex and realized this was his new girlfriend. I stared at the request for a full minute, my finger hovering over the decline button, but curiosity won and I accepted it. Her profile loaded and I scrolled through post after post about how funny and spontaneous her boyfriend was, how he always made her laugh, how she loved his sense of humor. Each caption felt like reading my own words from 2 years ago, back when I thought his pranks were charming instead of cruel. I wanted to message her and warn her, tell her to watch out for the moment when his jokes stop being funny and start targeting the things that hurt her most. But I knew she wouldn't believe me, that she'd think I was just a bitter ex trying to cause problems, because that's exactly what he'd tell her I was. I closed the app and put my phone face down on the coffee table, feeling sad for her, but knowing she'd have to learn the same lesson I did. 2 weeks later, Lada texted asking if I wanted to grab coffee and I said yes, meeting her at this small cafe near my apartment that had good pastries and quiet corners. We'd been messaging back and forth since our first phone call, but sitting across from each other in person felt different, more real. She told me about her new boyfriend, how he actually listened when she talked about her day, how he asked her opinion on things and respected her answers. I watched her face light up when she described him, and something clicked in my head about what I'd been missing all along. She asked how I was doing and I told her about therapy, about the progress I was making in recognizing manipulation patterns. We talked for 2 hours, and when we left, we made plans to meet again the following week. Not because we needed to process our shared experience with my ex anymore, but because we actually liked each other as people. That weekend, I finally opened the boxes of my dad's belongings that had been sitting in my closet since he died, the ones I'd been avoiding because my ex used to tell me I was dwelling on grief too much. I pulled out his old sweaters and his collection of mystery novels and his reading glasses that still had his fingerprints on the lenses. At the bottom of one box, I found his journal, the leather cover worn soft from years of use, and I sat on my bedroom floor reading his entries. He wrote about being proud of me when I got into college, about how I reminded him of my grandmother who never took anyone's nonsense, about hoping I'd find someone who appreciated my strength instead of trying to dim it. I cried reading his words, but it felt clean somehow, like grief without all the anger and confusion that had been mixed into it for so long. Salvador came over the next day and helped me create a memory box, sorting through everything and deciding what to keep close. We included the brown cardigan from Halloween, the one my ex had worn, after I'd washed it 3 times to get his smell out of the fabric. I tried it on and looked in the mirror, seeing my dad instead of my ex for the first time since that terrible night. Salvador watched me and nodded, understanding without me having to explain that I'd reclaimed something important. My therapist and I spent the next few sessions working on recognizing manipulation tactics in real time, learning how to spot gaslighting before it took root. She taught me responses to boundary violations, simple phrases I could use when someone tried to make me doubt my own feelings. We practiced me saying no without explaining myself, without justifying my decisions, just stating what I wanted and letting that be enough. She gave me homework to notice when I started making excuses for other people's bad behavior, to catch myself before I twisted their actions into something I could accept. I started going on casual dates through apps, nothing serious, just coffee or drinks to practice being around men again. The 3rd date I went on was with this guy who seemed nice enough until I didn't laugh at his joke about women drivers. His whole face changed and he got defensive, asking if I was one of those feminists who couldn't take a joke. I felt that old familiar pressure to smooth things over, to laugh and say I was kidding, to make him feel better about his bad joke. Instead, I stood up, put money on the table for my drink, and told him I was leaving. He called after me asking what his problem was, and I didn't even turn around, just kept walking to my car. Driving home, I felt this rush of power, like I'd passed some test I didn't know I was taking. Jimena called me the following week with an update about my ex that she thought I should know. She said he'd been complaining to their friend group that I was telling lies about him, trying to ruin his reputation. But instead of people taking his side, they started sharing their own stories about his pranks. Times when he'd crossed lines and then acted like the victim when called out. She said he was becoming more and more isolated as people connected the dots and realized his behavior was a pattern, not just isolated incidents. I listened to her talk and realized I felt nothing about his social consequences, no satisfaction or vindication, just a mild interest like she was telling me about someone I barely knew. That night, I went through my social media and blocked him on the last few platforms where we were still connected, the ones I'd kept open because some part of me wanted to know what he was doing. I deleted his number from my phone and removed the photos I'd hidden in a folder instead of deleting completely. The curiosity about his life faded over the next few days, and I caught myself not thinking about him for entire afternoons, then full days. I realized I genuinely didn't care anymore what he was doing or who he was with, or whether he ever understood what he'd done wrong. That indifference felt like the real ending of our relationship, more final than the breakup itself had been. The anniversary of my dad's death arrived, and I drove to the cemetery with Salvador and my mom, bringing flowers and one of Dad's favorite books to leave at the headstone. We stood there in the cold morning air, and I told them about ending the relationship, about the Halloween costume and everything that came after. My mom squeezed my hand and said Dad would be proud of me for standing up for myself, for not letting someone disrespect his memory. I believed her because I finally understood that loving someone's memory meant protecting it from people who would mock it, that honoring my dad included refusing to let anyone use him as a weapon against me. 3 weeks later, my boss called me into her office and I walked in nervous, wondering what I'd done wrong. She told me I was getting promoted to senior coordinator, that my work over the past year had been exceptional, and they wanted to give me more responsibility. I thanked her and walked back to my desk in a daze, pulling out my phone out of habit before I realized I'd been about to text my ex. The fact that he wasn't my first thought anymore, that I'd caught myself before making him part of my achievement, showed me how much I'd separated my sense of worth from his validation. I texted June and Arya instead, and they insisted on taking me out to celebrate that night. We went to our favorite restaurant and they made a toast to my promotion, genuinely happy for me without making it about themselves or diminishing it with jokes. I looked around the table at my roommates and realized this was what support looked like. People who celebrated my wins and sat with me through my losses without keeping score or making everything a competition. A few days later, I got a message from Marlon saying his brother finally started seeing a therapist after most of his friend group stopped talking to him. He said he thought I'd want to know, that maybe it would help with closure. I read the message twice and realized I didn't feel anything about it. No satisfaction that he was facing consequences, no hope that therapy would fix him, just this complete neutral feeling like he was telling me about a stranger. I typed back that I was glad he was getting help, but I didn't need updates about his progress. Marlon responded immediately saying he understood, and that my boundary was healthy, that I didn't owe his brother forgiveness or even curiosity about whether he changed. I put my phone down and went back to making dinner, and the whole interaction took maybe 5 minutes of my mental space instead of consuming my entire evening like it would have months ago. My healing wasn't connected to whether he ever understood what he did wrong, and that separation felt powerful in a way I couldn't fully explain. I started dating again around that time. Nothing serious at first, just coffee dates and walks in the park to see if I could trust my judgment about people. Most of the guys were fine but forgettable. The kind of first dates where you know by the appetizers that there won't be a second one. Then I met someone at a bookstore who asked what I was reading and actually listened to my answer instead of waiting for his turn to talk. We went for coffee, and somehow I ended up mentioning my dad when he asked about my family. Not planning to, but it just came out naturally. He didn't try to fix it or make jokes or change the subject. He just asked what my dad was like and listened while I told him about Dad's terrible puns and his obsession with building birdhouses. The contrast to my ex was so huge that I almost didn't trust it. Kept waiting for him to say something cruel disguised as humor or dismiss my feelings as too much. My therapist helped me work through that fear in our next session, pointing out that my distrust was a normal protective response, but I couldn't let my ex's behavior stop me from recognizing genuine kindness. We went on more dates and he kept being consistently respectful, asking before touching my hand, checking in about my comfort level, treating my stories about Dad like they mattered instead of like they were inconvenient emotions he had to manage. I told June and Arya about him after a month and they insisted on meeting him, doing this whole protective roommate routine that made me laugh, but also feel incredibly loved. He passed their test apparently because June texted me later that night saying he seemed really good for me, that she could tell he actually listened when I talked. The lease renewal notice showed up in our mailbox in March, and the three of us sat down to discuss whether we wanted to stay another year. Arya had been considering moving in with her girlfriend, but decided she wasn't ready yet, and June liked our location too much to leave. I realized I wanted to stay too, that this apartment had witnessed my absolute lowest point, but it was also where I rebuilt myself into someone who knew her worth. We signed the renewal papers together, and June made a joke about how we were stuck with each other, but it felt good instead of limiting. The space felt fully mine now. No trace of someone who didn't respect it or me, just 3 women who actually cared about each other building a home together. 6 months after Halloween, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I was genuinely happy in a way that had nothing to do with him or the breakup. I wasn't happy because I'd won some contest or because he'd finally apologized. I was just happy because I'd built a life where my feelings mattered and my boundaries got respected. I still missed Dad every day. Still had moments where I'd see something he would have loved and feel that sharp grief in my chest. But I could honor his memory now without someone turning it into entertainment. Could talk about him without fear of mockery. Could wear his cardigan and feel close to him instead of violated. The guy I was dating asked if he could meet my mom in Salvador, which felt like a big step, but also natural instead of scary. We drove out to visit them on a Sunday, and he brought flowers for Mom and asked Salvador about his woodworking hobby, and I watched him interact with my family without trying to be the center of attention or turn everything into a joke. Mom pulled me aside while the guys were looking at Salvador's workshop and told me this one seemed different, that she could see him actually caring about my happiness. I agreed because it was true, and that truth felt like the best possible outcome. Not some dramatic revenge or cosmic justice, just peace and the knowledge that I deserved better than what I'd accepted before.